before we settle in and get started. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us for today's webinar, Shared Power, Shared Futures, Global Practices for Societal Resilience. I don't have to tell anybody here that we're living through a time with overlapping crises, accelerating and overlapping crises. You could think of climate shocks, democratic erosion, conflict and violence, large-scale migration, public health emergencies, technological disruption, and deepening social fragmentation. These pressures interact, of course, with governance structures across the world. At the same time, institutions and communities across regions have developed concrete and often underdocumented practices that have allowed them to recover, adapt, and rebuild after rupture. The hypothesis of this webinar is that those forms of adaptation that do best involve distributing power, power sharing, in effect. We're going to spend our time together today really digging into the potential of power sharing, as well as its limits, to help societies adapt in changing conditions. Before we get going, though, I would like to just introduce myself and the center that is hosting this webinar today. I'm Danielle Allen. I'm the James Bryant Conant University Professor here at Harvard. I'm the director of the Democratic Knowledge Project and the Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation at the Ash Center, which is our host. The Ash Center acknowledges the land on which Harvard University sits is the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people. We also recognize the continuing presence of the neighboring Wampanoag and Nipmuc nations. So also a few logistics for you. Today's discussion is being recorded. You'll receive a link to the recording afterward. The video will also be available through a link on the Lab for Democracy Renovation website at the Ash Center's YouTube channel. We encourage your participation. Please submit your questions at any time via the Q&A button, right? You should see a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Just go ahead all the way through. Whenever something occurs to you, just please include it. We'll be then using those Q&A questions to introduce audience discussion and conversation. We'll make sure that there's ample time for audience Q&A. So I will begin with a few reflections on my own work on societal resilience and power sharing during COVID, but then we'll have a wonderful panel. I just want to let you know what's coming after I make some opening remarks. I will reintroduce folks at the right moment, but we'll have Valeria Ionin as a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and Europe Center. We'll have Adam Kahane, the co-founder of Rios Partners. We'll have Fatali Magadam, who's a professor in the Department of Psychology at Georgetown. And we'll have Palios Yamin, who's been a fellow here in our lab all year and is also the former scientific director of the Paris Institute for Advanced Study. So we'll return, and that will be the best part, really, when we have the chance to talk to all of these wonderful people who are experts in a deep way in our themes for today. But as I said, what I'm going to do to start is to share some lessons that I learned during the time of working on the COVID pandemic. So there are really three lessons I want to focus on about that period. One theoretical and then two practical, both of which I hope will help give us a framework for thinking about what power sharing means. For starters, I think it's important to recognize that we were able to emerge from the pandemic with a vaccine that was broadly distributed and able to really halt the disease in its tracks only because of collaborative interaction among the public sector, markets and firms, and civil society organizations. In other words, a sort of tripartite sort of institutional arrangement for tackling a collective action problem. Now, what I mean by that is that if you look at the vaccine, its role in the pandemic and the like, what you will recognize is that its rapid creation, production, and distribution were possible only because there had been decades of public sector investment in basic research, and that public sector investment enabled the discovery of mRNA, that then in turn enabled the creation of vaccines rapidly, a sort of new methodology for vaccine production. But of course, then there was the question of how to scale up production to a global level, and being able to distribute to the entire population. And so for that scaling effect, the capital intensity of firms was necessary. So those firms, Moderna, for example, Pfizer, and others, were able to rapidly accelerate production in a way that the public sector was struggling to do on its own terms. And again, it's because of the capital intensity of that, the structure of investment that made that scaling possible. By the same token, scaling the production of vaccines was by no means enough to deliver a solution for the world, because we were also struggling with significant problems of distrust of public health experts, distrust of science, distrust of politicians. At the end of the day, achieving actual vaccination required last mile work that only civil society was able to do effectively. Here in my state of Massachusetts, for example, it was local grassroots organizations that both developed the trust that people needed in order to accept taking the vaccine, and also facilitated getting people to vaccine clinics. So, for example, in the city of Boston, there was something called the Black Boston COVID Collaborative. In Western Massachusetts, there was the Berkshire's COVID Coalition. And both of these organizations were local civil society organizations, often led by faith leaders, or other sort of neighborhood associations that already had a long track record of doing good and important community work. They brought trust into the conversation. In other words, they were trustworthy to their communities. And they made the case for vaccination and then organized carpools and local clinics that were convenient for people to access and reach. And at least here in Massachusetts, that is then how the last mile of COVID vaccination took place. So we would not have been able to respond to the problem of the pandemic through the solution of vaccination without that triadic structure for solving collective action problems, bringing, again, the public sector, commercial capital, and civil society grassroots organizations into synergistic collaboration. Bringing them into collaboration required respecting the various kinds of expertise each brought, and in particular, respecting the expertise that the civil society and grassroots groups brought. They had to be at the table as leaders, as people who knew their community better than anybody else, and whose guidance would be accepted by others. In other words, they weren't put in the position of following instructions or just executing a playbook created by others. The playbook was theirs to create. And that was the really important moment of power sharing that made that collaborative synergy possible. Now, I want to, that was sort of the theoretical frame, the idea that you have to have collaboration across the three domains of the public sector, private sector, for-profit private sector, and civil society in order to tackle grassroots collective action problems, and also that having that collaboration depends on building power sharing into it. That's the sort of theoretical point that I hope what we might take as a frame for our conversation today, and test out how often do we see those kinds of collaborations with that power sharing appearing in ways that support resilience. And I want to share sort of two other examples from that COVID moment of places where shifting power made a really important difference for being able to respond in emergency conditions. So my own research network before the pandemic was one that brought together economists and public health professionals and ethicists. We had been working on things like the opioid crisis. So when the pandemic came, it was then reasonable and natural for us to pivot rapidly. We had the right kind of combined expertise to start thinking about how to address the pandemic. We were a group that very quickly argued that the lockdowns were not productive, not really the right way to go, too damaging to the economy, too damaging to mental health, that we needed an alternative solution that would align the values of protecting lives, liberties, and livelihoods. That you could do all those three things simultaneously. And our argument was that probably the right thing to do was to really ramp up the use of testing in order to sort of be able to track the virus, do contact tracing, and then sort of block its transmission. However, to ramp up testing required a kind of industrial scale up of the production of the materials needed for COVID tests. And so that's why you had to bring together the functionalities of the commercial economy as well as with the public sector and the like. At any rate, that was what we were working on in February 2020, March 2020. But in order to try to figure out whether or not we could develop a policy that would really be viable for interrupting the pandemic and its process, what we did was we pulled together a network of mayors from all over the United States to review the policy and to consider whether or not it made sense from where they sat, what they were trying to do to keep their communities safe. And we had an early meeting in March 2020 that was just really transformative for my own thinking about policymaking. We presented our argument to the mayors about the scaling up needed, the sort of quantity of testing that would be needed to interrupt the transmission of the virus. We made this presentation in the way that policymakers often do, by focusing on the aggregate and the macro, so the hundreds of millions of tests that would be necessary, and then what it would take in terms of industrial production to create the volume of tests that, as we modeled it as a sort of public health modeling, would be necessary to interrupt the transmission of the virus. And so the mayors, sort of sat around the meeting. It was a Zoom meeting, of course, and looked at all the materials and considered things. And then, one after another, they put their hands up and they said, well, this is great, but, how on earth does this actually help me? I, am the mayor of a town of 60,000 people. You tell me that the country needs 2.5 million tests a day. What, I've got 60,000 people. What can I do with this? This makes no sense to me. And so after a round of conversation, the policy group left the meeting and went away and decided that what we had to do was completely revise the policy and try to understand what you would have to do at a local level in order for the sum total of local efforts to aggregate to what we needed at a national level. And so we were able to sort of turn the policy completely inside out, rebuild it from scratch as a policy about what would be needed at a local level, sort of city by city, essentially, depending on your scale of population. And then from there, think about what you would need for both industrial production and distribution and so forth. So the point of this story was that, as a group of policymakers sitting in the ivory tower, we had developed the habits of thinking in sort of macro and aggregate way. And at the end of the day, that left us actually deeply and fundamentally sort of uninformed about both what was necessary and what was feasible. And it was precisely by shifting power, by saying to the mayors, okay, you tell us what are the questions you need to answer first, and then we'll try to build our policy sort of starting from your questions, that we actually did develop a framework for testing infrastructure for the country that was both what was needed, it was viable, in fact, eventually what happened, and also feasible because of the ways in which we had structurally reorganized it. So that lesson then flowed through into further work we did on schools as we sought to drive school reopening. We saw a similar dynamic happening in that space where policymakers were producing sort of macro level policy and then not actually attending to what frontline participants, school teachers, for example, knew and what they could contribute to shaping a policy. So, for example, you would have situations where there would be a sort of structure for how you might go about opening schools with mandates around open windows. But then you would go to the school and you would discover that that school building was a place where 10 years ago, all the school windows were nailed shut because of an approach to safety in the school. And nobody at the sort of top level policymaking had that knowledge, but all the educators knew that there was no way they were going to be actually able to open the windows in their classroom. And so some of the friction between educators and policymakers during the pandemic sort of emerged from that initial failure to take seriously that there's knowledge and expertise sort of distributed throughout the ecosystem that needed to be pulled into the deliberative process if you were going to develop a policy that had any chance of being both feasible and legitimate. So as we became clear that there's sort of this structural problem in terms of how policy was being made, what we really sought to do was try to help people reorganize their basic approach to making policy and try to help them move in a power sharing direction. So I'm going to share with you one artifact from that work. It comes from a document that we produced called Roadmap to Healthy Schools. We were trying to get schools open sort of faster than the normative directionality was going at that time in the US. And in order to do that, we realized that we needed to help people really understand how to share power across different levels and jurisdictions. And we produced something, I'm going to show you here, hopefully it's coming through, what people generally call a RACI chart. RACI charts are used across organizations to structure authorities and responsibilities. Now, typically, a RACI chart is just made out of the acronym RACI. And that acronym stands for Responsible, Accountable, Consulted, and Informed. We adapted the RACI chart and its sort of standard usage by adding an E. We put engaged in the middle of that. So that you have to begin by figuring out all the stakeholders involved in whatever the issue is that you're trying to address. Then you have to figure out who will be responsible, who will be the person who does the work and is responsible for the action or implementation, who will be accountable. So that's the person that approves the work and is ultimately answerable for it. But you also have to ask who will be engaged via inclusion in the development, implementation, review, and revision of the relevant action or policy plan. Then there will be people who are consulted. They are people who are kept in the loop. They provide subject matter expertise or a particular perspective. It's a two-way conversation, but it might be episodic. It's not continuous, whereas engagement is continuous. And then there are the people who are informed, the people who need to be kept updated. They need to know things, but it's generally a one-way communication. And so by adding this category of the engaged party alongside the consulted and informed party, what we were really doing was shifting power. RACI charts typically had structured things so that, one set of people had the power, those who were responsible and accountable, and then everybody else was either consulted or informed. But it was very clear that the power lay with those who were responsible and accountable. By introducing the engaged category, what we were doing is acknowledging that meaningful power actually sits outside of some of the formal authorities, and that you need structures of collaboration that can support sharing power between formal authorities and those who are perhaps outside that structure. So what we ended up doing was essentially creating a RACI chart, including with our E for engaged, for the entire sort of jurisdictional structure important for running and organizing schools. So there's the question of what states do. That is, say by states, I mean in the US are 50 states, like the state of Massachusetts or the state of New York. Then there was the question of what any given local educational organization, so the sort of school district, the local educational authority, how they set policies. Then you also have the school level where people are making decisions about infection and control. And then you have, of course, other aspects of implementation and evaluation. But across those functions, you have across the horizontal row at the top, I hope it's large enough for you to see, I can probably make it a little bit bigger, a range of stakeholders. So from federal agencies on the left, city councilors and mayors, school principals, all the way down to educators, school staff, parents, guardians, and the like. And so what we really tried to do was to help the formal authorities understand where they had a full responsibility to engage educators and parents and guardians. And so over time, this helped people adjust their practices in a power sharing direction. At the end of the day, making our way through the pandemic required rebuilding trust after very serious breakages and disruptions to interactions of trust and trustworthiness between formal authorities and communities. And in the places where we worked, this structure and this kind of guidance was part of the toolkit needed to help rebuild that trust and achieve functional, resilient responses in conditions of emergency. But so the last thing I'll say, just to bring this to a close, is that I hope this example makes clear how sort of concrete the work of power sharing can be. So it's not just a bunch of pretty words. It really does require us to think differently about organizations. And then once you do that, once you say that educators need to be engaged and not just consulted in a kind of episodic way, you actually have to rethink the internal structures of communication inside the school. You have to rethink job descriptions. And we found ourselves that helping principals actually rewrite job descriptions for their school staff so that that expectation of engagement could become a part of the norm of the work. So achieving a sort of set of institutions and political structures that have power sharing at their center is really a kind of comprehensive overhaul, or I would call it renovation, of the institutions of democratic societies. So we're going to dig deep today and I think a lot more about the different forms that power sharing can take. But I hope this gives you an initial window into at least my view about how power sharing can make a fundamental difference for achieving resilience in times of emergency. So thank you so much for indulging me by giving me the chance to share some of these thoughts. And now let me go ahead and stop sharing and invite all of our guests to go ahead and turn their cameras on, and I will do introductions for our panel. Let's see. Welcome, welcome. And we can get Dr. Moghadam on as well. We will get everybody going. Fantastic. All right, let me go ahead and get us started. First with Adam Kahane. I mentioned Adam is the co-founder of Rios Partners and the author of Collaborating with the Enemy, How to Work with People You Don't Agree With or Like or Trust. There was an awful lot of that happening during the pandemic for sure. So I look for, I'm sure, lessons I wish I had already learned at that time, but hopefully I'll learn them today. We also have Professor Vitaly Moghadam. As I said, he's in the Department of Psychology at Georgetown University. He is also the author of Threat to Democracy, The Appeal of Authoritarianism in an Age of Uncertainty. And Paulius Yamin, a policy fellow here, as I said, at the Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation, and the former scientific director of the Paris Institute for Advanced Study, as well as the former managing director of the University of Pennsylvania Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics. So what we are going to do is, in this conversation, begin by learning how the work of each of these wonderful panelists addresses social resilience and the capacity of societies to get out and recover after crisis. So let me start with Adam and Vitaly. So societies facing breakdown, whether through political polarization, authoritarian pressure, or violent conflict, must somehow hold together people who distrust, fear, or actively oppose each other. Adam, your work shows that collaboration across deep differences is possible without requiring agreement or trust, but it demands a particular relationship about power. Now, Vitaly, your omniculturalism framework suggests that leading with human commonality rather than difference may be a more durable foundation for social cohesion under pressure. I wonder, I'm going to ask each of you to say something about your approach, if you don't mind, but then what I'm going to ask you to explore with each other is whether your approaches contradict each other or complementary. So, Adam, perhaps you could go first and tell us more about that argument that you make, that agreement, or rather that collaboration does not actually require agreement or trust, but does require this relationship with power. If you could sort of articulate what you mean by that, that would be great. And then I'll ask Vitaly to do the same, and then we'll explore whether those are in fact contradictory.
Well, thank you. The work my colleagues and I have been doing over the last 35 years involves context of crisis. But when I say those words, I realize that this is not an unusual thing to be in a context of crisis, but for many of us, an ongoing situation. This is work I started in South Africa and have done in Colombia and my home country of Canada and 50 other countries around the world. And this crisis almost always is produced by and produces conflict between different powers. And it would be nice if in working together, we could agree on the problem, the solution, the plan, who does what, values, language, trust, etc. But my conclusion from my experience is that those are not necessary conditions. And if we assert their necessary conditions, then we'll make something which is already very difficult. Collaborating across difference will make it impossible. So that's the approach we've been taking. And if I connect it to your example, Danielle, I think what is implicit, two things are implicit in this work which need to be made explicit and reconciled. One is that we are parts of a larger whole. We're needing to work and live together, uh, for which the COVID is an excellent example. Um, uh, and at the same time, we're each wholes in ourselves, with differences and disagreements, and and so the way I'm thinking about this, having listened to you, is we need to work together. We all have power, and the requirement, and this is the difficult part, is to have institutions or containers that reconcile the fact that we each have power. We're trying to do our thing. We're trying to get something done. We're trying to realize ourselves and our objectives, and we're living together uh, as parts of a larger whole. And so I'm particularly interested in the containers that allow reconciling those two facts, which I call power and love. So um, I don't see a, I don't see it as a choice between either we work with the differences or the commonality, as I think the whole challenge is to be able to do both and to have governance and institutions that enable us to do both.
Thank you so much, Adam. Fatali, before I turn to you, let me just introduce Valeria Ionin. Thank you so much, Valeria, for joining us. Really appreciate it. Valeria is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and Europe Center, and serves as an advisor to the Minister of Defense of Ukraine and the Ministry of Digital Transformation of Ukraine. So thank you very much for taking time out of what I'm sure is an exceptionally busy schedule to join us today. Valeria, just to bring you up to speed, we're starting with a general discussion of how your work, each panelist's work, addresses social resilience, namely the capacity of societies to get out of crisis and recover from crisis. And we're starting to explore, points of connection or contrast among the different views. So, Adam, thank you for laying that out. Fatali, if I could turn to you, maybe you could also just generally explain how your work addresses social resilience and the capacity of societies to get out of crisis and recover from crisis.
Thank you for the opportunity to learn and share ideas with you. Let me explain omniculturalism, because it does seem confusing. Omni means all, and it starts with the premise that human beings are psychologically and biologically much more similar than they are different. And omniculturalism involves two stages. The first stage is up to about the age of 12, when children are taught to address the question, what is a human being? Their first challenge in education, I believe, is to understand the commonalities of humans based on scientific research. What does science tell us about human beings? And we know that men, women, different ethnic groups, different religious groups, etc., are all very, very similar. However, we have developed a culture of celebrating differences, and this has led to an exaggeration and fabrication of differences. And this fabrication of differences is ongoing. It is also being politically used by extremists to come to power, to grab power. So my development of this idea of omniculturalism has been in response to both cultural problems and political problems that I see ongoing in the Western world as well as the non-Western world. I was born in Iran. I returned to Iran with the 79 revolution. I researched there during the hostage taking and early years of the Iran-Iraq war. And I saw exactly this process of celebrating differences and accentuating differences used by extremist leaders to grab power. In some ways, my approach is very similar to Adam's, actually, because the second stage of omniculturalism, starting from around the age of 12, is the teaching of differences. What are the differences? But this has to be on a scientific basis. What does science tell us about differences? And of course, we come back to the basic fact that human beings are far more alike biologically, psychologically, than they are different. We have to change the culture of accentuating, fabricating, and celebrating differences in so many different ways and teaching children to give priority to differences. We're now in a situation where children, when they are socialized in this way, the first thing they do is they look for differences. So my basic step is to move towards cooperation and peace by encompassing humans in one group. And there is very solid psychological evidence, empirical evidence, going back to research in the 1950s, the superordinate goal research, the work on jigsaw classrooms, the current research on the common group identity model. All this empirical research shows that emphasizing commonalities is the way to go, is a much more effective way of bringing about peace. Thank you.
So thank you so much. So I think I'm hearing, before I turn to Valeria and Paulius, I just want to clarify, I think I'm hearing from Adam a focus on institutional containers and from Fatali a focus on culture. Is that fair, Adam, or was I mishearing you? Sorry.
No, I'm using the word container to include both institutions, rules of the game, culture, assumptions, etc.
Okay.
I think I agree with Fatali. We might differ in the emphasis or the sequence, but my important conclusion is that only emphasizing difference without commonality produces fragmentation and war, and only emphasizing commonality without difference produces authoritarian forced unity. And so the whole challenge for these containers is to reconcile these two. And I guess the only other thing I'd say is I've perhaps because of the cultural tendency you've emphasized, Fatali, I find it useful to start with enabling people to express their own wholeness with all its similarities and differences before trying to say, and therefore this is what we can do together. But this is, I think, a secondary point.
All right, and then one more question for both of you before I transition over. So where does power sharing fit in? That is to say, I mean, obviously, peace at the end of the day requires sort of power sharing, so it's sort of the goal. But what can you say about, Adam, in your case, the container, or Fatali, in your case, the culture, that helps us understand it? If one wants to get to stable practices of power sharing, what does that then mean for what we need of the container or the cultural work?
Well, I'll answer quickly because I hadn't been using the term power sharing as such, but because all of my work has been about multiple actors working together horizontally to address issues of shared concern, and because I'm emphasizing enabling all parties and actors and sectors to express their perspectives, their history, their power, then I'm power sharing is at the very foundation, and I'm just what have been working on it in practice and theory is how does one accomplish the fact that there are multiple parties with power who also are part of a larger whole, who also need to work and live together.
Okay, thank you. And Fatali?
Power sharing, I believe, is only possible when we begin with the assumption that all the individuals and groups have the same rights and duties, and they are the same in capability. If we begin with an emphasis on differences, this is picked up by different groups, particularly power-seeking groups, who emphasize their view that some groups and some individuals don't have the abilities, don't have the necessary skills to participate in power sharing. This is the inevitable outcome of giving priority to differences. These differences will be used by potential dictators as they are being used right now in the United States.
Thank you. Okay, great. That's a lot of rich material. And now we will connect it to the work of Valerian Paulius. So Valerian Paulius, both Ukraine and Colombia represent contexts where conventional assumptions about stability, institutional capacity, and governance have been or are being repeatedly tested by war, fragility, and social fragmentation. Yet both countries have also, under incredible duress, generated concrete innovations in digital public infrastructure, defense technology, behavioral change, and civic reform. And these often include changes in how actors coordinate without centralized control. So let's just start with open-ended question about, what have each of you learned about the conditions that allow societies to build resilient systems, especially with a focus on that sort of more horizontal coordination outside of centralized control. Valeria, do you want to go first?
Yes, sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me, and apologize for some problems with connection. I have two stories for you to answer this question. So the first one is that, today Ukraine is the fifth country in the world in terms of digital public services. For comparison, we were on 102nd place in 2018. So it's like 97 positions progress only in 6 years in digital transformation. Pretty nice progress. But it all started in 2019 when President Zelensky was elected, and he promised to build a state in a smartphone. And in order to achieve that, a new ministry, a Ministry of Digital Transformation, was built from scratch. And a new minister, who was also the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister Fedorov, was assigned to lead this effort. And only in 6 years, basically, Ukraine has achieved this great result and made this digital revolution. What does it mean in practice? We had the big vision. We want to build the most convenient digital state in the world. And we have created an ecosystem of digital products, which is called DIA, with the core product, which is State Super App, which is used by 24 million of users. It's more than the half of the population of Ukraine. So DIA is installed on 70% of smartphones. And Ukraine was the first country in the world where digital passports has the same force as paper or plastic documents. And today, I think that we have more than 30 digital documents available in DIA, more than 70 services, and lots of other products of the DIA ecosystem, like DIA Business to support SMEs, DIA Education to support digital literacy, DIA City to support digital economy, and others. But the most important thing here is that DIA completely changed the way how citizens interact with the government. And, when COVID happened in 2020 and 2021, we thought it's the biggest challenge. But we were able to create services pretty fast, the COVID certificates and some other services related to that. But then in 2022, the full-scale Russian invasion started. And, we saw, we had to adapt to the new challenges that we saw in our country. So when for the first time, Russian missiles started to hit residential areas, people, for the first time in their lives, they went to the shelters. We understood they don't have any access to news, so we embedded TV and radio into state super app DIA. Then a lot of people had to relocate from one region to another because of the Russian aggression. And the government had to support these people, our citizens. And so we have created a service just in a few days, which helped Ukrainian citizens to receive an IDP status, internally displaced person, just in 2 clicks. And then when you receive this status, you could receive social financial assistance also through DIA. Then a separate service, e-recovery, which helps to receive compensation for destroyed or damaged property because of Russian aggression. E-enemy, a chatbot which helps Ukrainians to inform armed forces about Russian troops or Russian equipment. And many, many other services which we had never thought about have been created not in months, but in days or even in weeks. And and we were able to do that just because we already had the digital infrastructure which was in place. Moreover, I would actually say that we have continued to do other services, like, for example, e-marriage, which is a full cycle online, starting from a proposal, which is sent by the state super app, via the state super app. And then when you say yes, you could come and choose date and time and come to the video call and actually sign with your digital signature and receive the certificate of marriage. And by the way, this service was featured as one of the 100 best inventions of the year in Time magazine. And this is a great example that you don't need to have a war, or you don't need to have a crisis to be prepared for it. You have to be prepared in advance, and you need to work, on the infrastructure, on the capabilities that will make you capable to work with the challenges that you even cannot imagine. The second example, I'll be much shorter this time, is that, again, when the invasion started, at that time, the Minister of Digital Transformation, Mikhailo Fedorov, who is now the Minister of Defense, he understood that we need technology to beat the aggressor. And so in 2022, a project which was called Army of Drones started, and we started to fundraise for drones. We fundraised 5,000 drones. It was not enough. And so we turned to local producers. In 2022, there was 7 drone producers in Ukraine. And we saw that there is a lot of blockers in legislation that had to be changed. And only in like 3 months, the team of Ministry of Digital Transformation had made changes to more than 30 different acts and resolutions, which made the procedure for procurement easier, procedure for exploitation easier, created separate zones for drone pilots, increased the margin for drone producers. And as a result of this policy of opening the market, in 2023, we already had 100 drone producers. In 2024, 300. In 2025, already 400. Now we have more than 500 drone producers in Ukraine, and also a lot of other defense tech companies in other sectors. So basically, another lesson is to open markets and to create conditions where businesses can thrive and where governments could use the innovation from the private sector, because all the innovation is always born in private sector. And if government wants to be agile, wants to be efficient, and wants to be innovative, it has to work with the private sector as well. So that's basically 2 examples. And I think that both digital transformation example and the example with changing the policies, they have a lot to do with the topic of resilience.
Thank you so much, Valeria. Lots and lots of questions I have to follow up. But first, let's get Paulius in. And so Paulius, same question, thinking about Colombia. What have you learned about the conditions that allow societies to build resilient systems?
Yes, thank you. So yeah, what I'm working on at the Allen Lab this year has 2 sides, I would say. I will speak about the smaller one first. I am looking at how specific interventions by the mayor of Bogota, my hometown, 20 years ago, aimed to change the culture around democracy and being a citizen and living together. And the largest part is looking at food sustainability initiatives around the world, which include private, public, and social initiatives as well, from farms to government institutions to companies, and to look at how they are governed, especially towards the outside, towards other actors, and how they interact with them, and so on, and whether they use some dimensions of power sharing in that. So what they both have in common, and this is a little bit the answer to the question, is the relational capacity, and how they show different dimensions of what in power sharing is called civic friendship. So the actors that have a commitment together and recognize each other as somehow legitimate, and to choose to remain in relation even if it's costly in the short term. So yeah, there are two examples as well that I think are reveal a little bit. This one is from Bogota. So one of the things this mayor did was to put life-size cardboard cutouts, like dummies of policemen in the street intersections. And the face was a hole. So people could look from the other side and look at cars, and the cars wouldn't know if it was a real policeman, because a real policeman used to stand there, or if it was any citizen looking at them. And the basic idea behind that is something that makes me think about authoritarian and top-down responses to crisis and to coexistence problems, like in this case, where traffic norms were widely ignored in the city. And it's something we used to say with the people that work on that, which is you can't have a policeman in each corner, but you do have citizens. What you must do is give them some tools to act and to improve coexistence among themselves, which is dangerous as well if you go too far. But if you canalize it positively, it can create interesting initiatives of collective action with peaceful interactions, which are really important. And the other example is from the sustainability work, and how we have found in Colombia some very old for Colombia companies. They are over 100 years old, and they have been able to develop a network of relations and partners across the value chain, and they have been able to share a little bit of power with those actors. So they are able to speak and collaborate a little with both sides of the conflict. So they do it with the government, they do it with the communities, and they do it with illegal actors as well. And they find compromises to, in this case, keep producing fruits in very problematic areas, sometimes controlled by illegal groups, and to be able to take the fruit out of those regions to buy it and generate income from those communities that would otherwise be completely out of the outside economic system. So I think what those two things show is that institutions are important, of course, but these networks, the relational infrastructure is really important as well. And it's not a given. It's not with policy and institutions only that it will emerge. I think it needs tools for people and long-term work.
So that was really helpful, Paulius. And maybe your last phrase there, relational infrastructure, gives us a way of pulling the threads in this conversation together. Valeria gave us stories that are about essentially a rapid rewiring of the state's relationship to citizens. And that rewiring then also supported citizens being able to maintain relationships with each other in conditions when they were being pressured and could have broken. People didn't have access to news and the like. So I think that counts as an example of, smart adaptation of relational infrastructure. And then I think Adam and Fatali, you're also both thinking about relational infrastructure. Is that a useful phrase? Is Paulius giving us something there that can help us sort of name what is needed for healthy societies and emerging from conditions of pressure and crisis? Maybe Adam, go back to you for a moment.
Yes. I hadn't put the two words together, but I think both are crucial. Infrastructure, that's to say, institutions, cultures, rules, relationships. I would just like to add another word, which I think is crucial here, and I believe connects to some of your other work, Danielle, which is the word I'm using for infrastructure that enables everybody to exercise their power and to live together well. The word I use for that is justice, or infrastructures that are just. That the definition I'm proposing for justice is containers that enable self-realization and living together.
Let me bring it to Valeria. I think that's really helpful, Adam. Thank you. And so Valeria, I think your story does give us a pretty clear picture of a pretty rapid transformation of relational infrastructure. I'm sure it has also raised questions and not been without some controversy to have the sort of state, consolidate services and identity, et cetera, all through digital tools. I'm sure is also raising questions about surveillance and data and privacy and the ability to maintain sort of freedom away from state control. So talk a bit about the challenges of the new kind of relational infrastructure that you guys have been developing. What do people raise as the challenges, and how would you respond to them?
Look, state already has your data. Any state has your data. And it's not about consolidating services. It's the role of the state to provide services for the citizens. This is the role of the state to serve the citizens in the most ethical and most responsible way. So this is the main role why actually the state and the governance exists, is to serve citizens and to ensure the prosperity, the security of the country, right? Another question is how this data is used. And and also, of course, the question of the security. And here are lots of different aspects. On the, let's say, strategic layer, it is very important to understand why any government, why any country needs digital transformation and what's coming next. I'll give you an example. So we want to build the most convenient digital state in the world. So it would be easy for any citizen to open a business in Ukraine just within a few clicks. That the citizens would not spend hours spending in lines and queues waiting for the service, that they would save. The most important thing is basically their hours of life, not communicating to state and receiving all that they need efficiently and quickly, right? And in order to do that, the DIA ecosystem in Ukraine was built. And for example, DIA as an app doesn't store any personal data. DIA as an app uses the approach which is called data in transit, which means that it connects directly to different state registries which are located and which are under responsibility of different ministries, and shows you the data which is requested in a particular moment of time. Another thing is that there is, an intention basically, and there are already several steps is in some of the services when you get notified when your data is been checked or been viewed. This, for example, is working in some other countries. In Ukraine, there is a service when someone is looking at your credit history, right? So this is also, there are a lot of, let's say, guardrails that could be implemented in order to secure this process as much as possible. In terms of architecture and in terms of, let's say, technical side of things, in Ukraine, bug bounties are conducted specifically for the app, which means that this is a contest where the ethical hackers could help to find even minor vulnerabilities of a state app or state digital systems. And so those bug bounties were and are conducted. There is red and blue team. So there are a lot of guardrails on the technical side as well. So the next step after digital state would be agentic state, right? So it would be even more convenient, even more useful for a citizen, when previously you had to go to an app and you have to choose a service and do a few clicks. Now with agentic AI, an AI assistant could do it on request on your behalf and could do it much. Right, but that's completely another story. So I think every story has different angles, and I am a techno-optimist. I think that digital transformation and AI and technology would bring us, like really in future, abundance for everybody. And I think it would help us a lot. And you could always use the instrument like a knife to cut something to get food, but you also could use a knife in other ways. And so the most important question is the guardrails, is not whether the knife is a good or bad thing, is the approach.
And so my question for you is, do you think that the concept of relational infrastructure can help us clearly communicate about the kinds of guardrails that are needed? That is to say, if we recognize the technological infrastructure you're describing as in fact a form of relational infrastructure, if we have standards for relationships, which, for example, if Vitaly and Adam are articulating standards for relationships, does that begin to give us content for those guardrails? I'm sure you already have content for the guardrails. I'm not trying to suggest you don't, but what I'm wondering is this a kind of helpful iteration on a way to approach the guardrails?
Well, yes, but I think that it is important, of course, to talk and to think about guardrails. And let's say, I'll give you an example. Everybody is talking about ethical usage of AI, but how many of digital states do you know in the world? How many agentic states do you actually know? So there are a lot of conversations, but because there are a lot of conversations, there is not so many examples. There are not so many successful examples. So you have to basically do POCs, iterate. You have to take responsibility and build, something, and then parallel think in guardrails and then scale it. You can't just talk about the guardrails while not doing nothing, right? Yeah, so it could be different approaches, but what's most important is to understand what vision and what goal do you have and move to this goal in parallel with building those guardrails. That's what I would say.
Okay, appreciate that. Thank you, Valeria. So Vitaly, coming back to you, you're a psychologist. I'm very curious how this phrase relational infrastructure sounds to you. That is, you're all about relationships, but maybe it doesn't make sense to connect that concept to an infrastructure concept.
Well, the question that comes for me is, what are the conditions in which relational infrastructure moves forward? And Valeria's example, I think, is a very interesting one because it's an example of a group, a country under threat. And what happens when people are threatened? Well, sometimes very good things happen. They coordinate, they collaborate. Why? Because they are all in it together. And in this being in it together, they are emphasizing similarities again.
Right.
I would argue that relational infrastructure moves forward under certain conditions, and one of those conditions is when people see themselves in the same boat.
Right. Got it. Interesting. So you're suggesting, I think, Fatali, if I'm hearing you rightly, that in any conditions of crisis, you can go either of two ways. You could be able to get that narrative about being in the same boat and emphasize commonality, and then you have the capacity to transform relational infrastructure in ways that support social cohesion and stability and the like. Or you might, double down on tribalism and the like, in which case you will also actually undermine your ability to respond to whatever the crisis or emergent problem is. Is that a fair rendering?
Yes, it's very fair. And the second avenue is the one adopted by authoritarian leaders.
Right.
Because it helps them to maintain their monopoly power.
So this is helpful. I think these ideas are coming together. So if I grab, Adam, your comments about justice as well, then partly what is happening in this conversation is we are naming a very powerful approach to the concept of justice that lies in relationships. And in this second concept, relational infrastructure, relationships can either really be structured through relationship. That's being tautological here. Relationships can be structured through practices and patterns of domination, or they can be structured through patterns and practices of power sharing. So I think that's kind of what's sort of deep under this conversation as we're sort of surfacing a kind of concept of justice. And so we have been talking about the way in which achieving justice is about ensuring that the relationships in a society are organized around patterns of power sharing, not patterns of domination. And then we're trying to understand the conditions for achieving that. We have this kind of container concept. I think Pallius's relationship infrastructure or relational infrastructure is connected to that container concept. And as Adam said, containers are institutions, they're also norms and practices. But Fatali and Valeria, you've really kind of given us sort of a powerful focus on the moments of pressure themselves and how the moments of pressure either help people, sort of toward that container that supports that just relational infrastructure, or might degrade that. And I take the point about narratives of division versus narratives of commonality as being a part of what matters in those moments of pressure and crisis. So this is an incredibly rich conversation. Yes, Adam, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would just like to complicate things a little bit. I've been working over the past few years in Australia with Aboriginal people who have a 65,000 year uninterrupted culture of governance. So maybe some things to pay attention to. And what I think is important is I don't think the contrast between collaboration and tribalism, or unity and tribalism, is helpful. I think it's always both. There's always groups, whether institutions, tribes, families, states, provinces, communities, which are wholes in themselves, and the extent to which we have to live together. So the infrastructure which is required, the containers which are required, are about reconciling the two essential facts that we're wholes in ourselves at different scales, and we're living together. And the little bit I understand of the intricate infrastructures and protocols and kinship systems amongst Australian Aboriginal people, it's all about reconciling the fact that we are many and we're one. Both are true. So I So at least in English, the word tribalism is almost always used negatively, and I think it's unhelpful.
Fatali, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, I completely agree that there is always two sides to this. Human beings are in many ways similar to one another, and in some ways, each person is unique. We can so have that kind of discussion. But at a societal level, the question is, which do we give priority to? Do we give priority to the science that tells us about human commonalities and back that up with an emphasis on the universal rights and duties that people have? Each person has a right and a duty simply because of being human, not because they are of that tribe or this tribe, but because they are human, they have those rights and duties. And I believe that is the emphasis that is needed rather than the tribalism emphasis, because psychologically, my argument would be that if you emphasize differences, you get where we are at the moment. Enormous power disparities and discrimination and everything else we're getting.
And Paulius, do you want to weigh in here? I mean, I think from your Columbia example, I sort of took you to be suggesting that it might not be a matter of sort of starting with narratives about identity, but rather about putting people in active positions of connection. I mean, the example of citizens everywhere having the chance to help build positive norms, sort of starting from a different place in terms of trying to generate that sense of social cohesion. Maybe that's right or wrong. I don't know. You tell me, Paulius.
Yes, that's right. In the work about sustainability initiatives, we're looking at 32 in all the continents, and of course it's a limited sample. But what we're seeing, which was really interesting to me, are two dimensions. On the one hand, when you ask people in Europe initiatives how they work together, they will, with other actors, they will say we work with this and this thanks to this formal instance and this coordination mechanism and this law and so on. When you speak with Global South initiatives, or however you call them, they will tell you more about relationships. And we've been working with these actors for 10 years and we trust them and so on. And then the other thing we're finding, which goes more directly to your question, is that we see much more connections and much more dependence and collaboration between actors in the oldest actors, the ones that have been there for a long time, in Colombia specifically. And the way they explain it is that they need those relations and that trust to operate in a context that is fragile and changing and where markets are not as developed. And the newer initiatives sometimes have more discourses around that and they try to design for that, but in practice they have less connections and relations. So these relationships, that is to say that these relationships and collaborations can be designed and should be designed, but it seems that it's through this contact and this living together through difficulties and not disappearing when there is a crisis together, that these things get more solid. So maybe we need both, I would say.
Okay, thank you. There are a number of questions in the Q&A. I'm going to transition to audience questions now, and so please, I invite the audience to continue to add questions. There are a number of questions that are really trying to figure out the limits of this potential to achieve collaboration. And I want to actually bring one to you, first of all, Valeria. Here, there's a question of how community figures in collaboration or power sharing efforts in an atmosphere of distrust. How can strong bonds of trust be generated? I'm just curious in the Ukrainian context, whether there were elements of internal societal polarization or distrust that pre-existed the Russian invasion that had to be overcome as a part of successfully moving these transformation initiatives forward. And if so, how did that unfold?
I think I don't really understand that question.
Okay,
Yeah, so if we could maybe rephrase it so I could
sure.
understand it. What
Yeah,
do you mean by polarization and the full-scale Russian invasion? Like the war in Ukraine is since 2014 when Russia actually invaded Ukraine, and then
right.
there was the Russian invasion. So I'm not sure that I really get the question correct. So we are a sovereign independent country and the aggressor state invaded and we are defending it. So I think that all Ukrainians are defending our country, and maybe I just don't get the question correct. So I'm sorry.
Right. No, don't worry. That's fine. No, I wasn't, I suppose. And so it may be the answer is that there were not, that it may be that because of the external pressure, internal sort of political divisions had so been reduced in salience that it's not a pertinent question. But that's, I think in some sense what I'm asking. I mean, Ukraine has had its own internal contestations over the last decade plus. So at some level, there must be some sense of different political positions and points of view within society. And so the question was really at whether that's back in 2010, prior to the first aspects of the invasion, or more recently, whether there were proactive things that were done to sort of achieve that sense of everybody being in it together.
I think well, Ukraine is a democratic country where everyone has the right for for his or her views, including
Mhm.
for personal views as well. And so I doubt that I can really answer that question. So as of now, we have a very clear situation. We have an aggressor state who is attacking us every day. Just a few days ago, it was one of the biggest ballistic missile in Kiev. And so, it's difficult for me to talk about this kind of questions right now. I'm not living in that context. I'm living in a context when we have to defend our country, and all Ukrainians want to win this war, to end this war, and we have only one goal as of now.
Mhm. Okay, no, I think that's, yeah, Fatali, I was gonna say, I think that's A, evidence of Fatali's point, and B, an answer to the question. So
Just
Fatali.
a quick point here. I think leadership is so very, very important. We humans have a universal in that we all have leaders. Every society has leaders. When I went back to Iran in 79, I ended up writing a book on the psychology of dictatorship, which starts with the contrast between Mandela and Khomeini.
Mm,
Think about where Mandela took South Africa and where Khomeini took Iran.
right.
Completely different paths.
Mhm.
So
Say more about that. So, I mean, I think the Mandela story is familiar to people in a way that the Khomeini story probably isn't. So can you say a bit more about some of those key differences between the two leaders from a point of view of leadership style?
in 79, when I got back to Iran, Khomeini arrived. There was absolute freedom. Women were in the universities without the hijab. They were not forced to do anything like that. We had a lot of freedom of speech. Within 9 months, Khomeini completely destroyed not only freedom for women, but freedom for men as well. The hostage taking crisis he used as a tool to crack down on anyone who disagreed with him. Within a year, we had gone from revolution and freedom to absolute dictatorship. So we lost our opportunity there, and we've been on this terrible path ever since.
Mhm. Okay.
Contrast that with South Africa, where Mandela really emphasized the commonalities of all people in South Africa. His wonderful leadership was amazing, and it took South Africa not on a great path, but at least on a peaceful path.
Mhm.
And I'm sure
Okay.
Adam could say more about that.
Yeah. Adam, I was going to bring the next question to you. These are big and hard questions, so I'm not sure how many of them we're actually going to be able to get in, but let me go ahead and bring this one to you. This one comes from Sean Kimmel. And he writes, I'm going to go ahead and just read this one. The principle of collaborating with the enemy during crisis that you've articulated to some degree implies the enemy has at least some grounding of commitment to some kind of common good that allows for working together in collaboration with others. So how does this framework apply to situations of governance where dictatorship and potentially even fascism or totalitarian evil wielding powers and Nazism or some developing circumstances in contemporary contexts? This is not a mere situation of difference, but of one side committed to seizing power and denying any sharing of power with others. How do we develop strategies of sharing power when the government is dedicated to seizing power from all who could oppose it? Also, the example that Vitali just gave in that contrast. So, Adam, that one comes to you.
Yeah, thank you. I saw the question from Sean, and this is probably the single biggest change I made in rewriting the book, Collaborating with the Enemy, with input from Paulius and others. And I think the example of Nazism is important in at least three ways. But maybe the most important thing to say, which I want to start with, is I would never say that collaborating is the only option. I think this is obviously a false statement. It's impossible to collaborate with everybody on everything. The interesting question is not whether you're in favor of collaboration, but on what, when, with whom. And we have other options: forcing, trying to do what we want regardless of what other people want, adapting to the situation as it is, exiting. And so collaborating is one of four options. So I never want to be misunderstood as saying that collaborating is the only option. And to work on this in France, as I did with Paulius, you immediately run up against the important fact that in English, and especially in French, the word collaborating has two opposite meanings. It means to work jointly with, how we're using it in this conversation, but it also means to betray. There's no word more harsh in French than to call somebody a collabo. It immediately evokes collaborating with the Nazis. Now, just two more points about this, because I think it's really a rich subject. First of all, I think Sean's point is important, and I find that these conversations about collaboration often jump immediately to the extreme. When I wrote the first edition of this book, I was putting chapters on, I think, on Facebook at the time, and every time I would post a chapter, one of my distant cousins would say, "Surely you're not proposing to collaborate with the Nazis." So to take this complex and nuanced subject and immediately move it to the Nazis, I think, is not helpful. And my final point is the most important. When I published Collaborating with the Enemy, one of my colleagues, Zaid Hassan, warned me, said, "This is a terrible title, Adam. You risk being seen as crypto-Schmittist," which I didn't understand at the time, but I now think is a crucial point. Carl Schmitt, the Nazi political scientist and legal theorist, is famous for having said that the world is divided between friends and enemies. friends the people we would die for, and the enemies the people we would kill. And my conclusion, and one of the biggest changes in the second edition of this book, is to agree with Zaid that this deciding ex ante who is a friend and who is an enemy, that we can only work with our friends and never work with our enemies, is a terrible mistake. Often we don't need to collaborate with our friends. They're our friends, but there's nothing particular we have to do with them. And the most important people we have to find a way to work with is people who are our enemies. So for me, the conclusion is, let's understand that this question about who to work with, who to collaborate with, is one big gray area. And the question is, in particular circumstances, who do we need to work with, when, on what, why? And it doesn't, to put it in these black and white terms, we could always work with these people and never work with these people, it is not helpful at all.
Pallius, you want to share any thoughts about that? I don't know if you agree or disagree.
It's a difficult question, and I remember Adam giving a talk a few months back at the Institute in Paris and getting the same question. I guess it's quite common, no? I was just, it's a partial answer, I guess, but I was thinking about Colombia and the political context, because we just had the first round of elections, and we are having the next in 2 or 3 weeks. What we were discussing with a former minister the other day is how, after the peace process with the communist guerrilla groups in 2016, rather before that, there were political divisions, but at least the political establishment was more or less unified across a vision. We never had like a left president from the left. They were all either center or right. And then after the peace process, the conflict hasn't ended. It has like exploded in many small actors and so on. But what we have seen is a large polarization in the political space. So we've had, after the peace process, a president from the towards the extreme on the right, then one in the left, and now after the first round of the elections, the two candidates that remain for the second round are extreme right and extreme left. So it seems this thing about the common enemy, like Valeria was saying, has a lot to do, and it's complex, no? I don't know what's preferable. If you have a common enemy, you are cohesive in the group, and then if you don't, you start fighting inside that group. It's complicated, I would say.
Well, this is a very hard conversation. Yes, challenging themes to engage. I appreciate everything you've all contributed. We are running out of time here. I will just add my own sort of small thoughts in relationship to the question Adam just answered. The way I have come to think about this is essentially that typically there are more people in the kind of category of quote unquote enemy that you can collaborate with than you might think up front, but there is also a limit to that. And that part of the important work is clarifying that limit. What you should never do is collaborate with the enemy on the enemy's objectives. All right. And so that forces a certain kind of clarification of the terrain. And I do remember hearing a couple of years ago some comments where I'm going to forget her name, but a woman who really helped lead the peace processes in Ireland. And she had quite early on sort of sat down with people across the line that for each side, those were people who were responsible for violence. So that's sort of how far she was going in trying to figure out how to collaborate with the enemy. And that was in fact transformative for the whole dynamic. It permitted identifying the kind of community of people, all of whom just like wanted to stop the violence. And then also that produced the clarification for so anybody who wasn't willing to come into that frame of stopping the violence, then they were the enemies of everybody else, essentially. So there is a limit. I mean, I think you cannot collaborate with all enemies. I just, that is not actually humanly possible, I would say. But the limit is typically not as near as we usually think it is. And being able to move that limit is often critical to changing the basic dynamic of the conflict. Again, though, defining that limit is about ensuring that you're not collaborating on the enemy's objectives. You're insisting on the objectives of peace as being the thing around which people are going to be collaborating. And so in that regard, you do change the meaning of collaboration, right? And that's how you change it, is by shifting which objectives collaboration is connected to. I think that's a really sort of important point in trying to work through that dynamic. So thank you all for giving of time and head and heart to this. I mean, we are all wrestling through some tough things as we try to achieve stable, peaceful, prosperous futures for our societies in a time of immense conflict and aggression. So thank you all for joining us. And thank you to the audience as well for your great and difficult questions. So be well.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.